The past was never quiet. Beneath the hymns and the hammering of cathedrals, medieval Europe whispered strange stories of saints and monsters, charms and curses, winters that broke men, and miracles that kept them standing. Tonight, we're going to wander through that world, not as scholars in a classroom, but as travelers, walking through candlelight and fog, listening to what people once believed about life, death, and everything in between. This is the disturbing world of medieval folklore and life. The shape of medieval belief. When we talk about the Middle Ages, most people imagine castles, plagues, and knights who couldn't pronounce the word hygiene. But underneath all that armor and mud was a world humming with superstition. To live in medieval Europe was to share your house with ghosts, saints, angels, fairies, and whatever uninvited spirits happened to pass through the chimney. Religion provided the headline story of existence, but folklore filled in the gaps. It explained the strange noises at night, the bad harvests, the milk that suddenly soured. Every village had its own logic. A cat crossing your path might be a warning. A sneeze could mean your soul had briefly escaped and needed to be retrieved with a quick "God bless." This was less theology and more daily insurance policy. Most peasants never traveled beyond a few miles of their birthplace, so stories were the only currency that crossed borders. They spread slowly, like smoke, carried by traders, monks, or soldiers who swore they'd seen something impossible just beyond the next hill. A man from France told a story in England. It mutated in Wales, and by the time it reached Scotland, it involved a talking raven and a bishop with goat legs. That's how folklore grows, through boredom, fear, and the human need to sound interesting at dinner. People believed the natural and supernatural overlapped constantly. A church bell might keep away demons, but only if it was blessed by a priest who hadn't committed any suspicious sins that week. A crooked tree could mark the spot where fairies danced, which was both charming and inconvenient for anyone needing firewood. And if your cow suddenly stopped giving milk, there was always the possibility that your neighbor had borrowed your luck through witchcraft. Accusing them was practically a social ritual. The medieval mind was both deeply rational and deeply magical. A farmer could calculate the seasons with care, then pour ale on the ground for the spirits of the field. Scholars debated philosophy by day and consulted the stars by night. Nobody saw a contradiction. The world was alive with meaning, and ignorance wasn't stupidity. It was simply an unfinished map. Behind this worldview sat one central idea, that everything visible had an invisible twin. Illness had a moral cause. Storms had a personality. Even bread had a mood. You could call it superstition, or you could call it the first attempt at psychology, an effort to make sense of chaos before microscopes and weather forecasts took the fun out of life. In this series, we'll wander through that landscape of belief, the creatures that haunted it, the customs that sustained it, and the occasional moments of grim humor that kept people sane. Because the medieval world wasn't only brutal, it was astonishingly imaginative. Their monsters reflected their fears, their saints their hopes, and their stories. Well, those were the nightlights that kept the dark from swallowing them whole. Fairies, spirits, and the hidden folk. Every patch of wilderness in the medieval imagination had tenants. People spoke of the hidden folk, fairies, elves, brownies, boggarts, creatures that minded their own business until someone tripped over their front door. The official church line was that such beings didn't exist, or if they did, they were demons in disguise. The villagers, meanwhile, quietly left a bowl of milk on the doorstep and decided it was better not to argue with either side. Fairies were not the winged, sugar dust versions that later painters adored. They were unpredictable, clever, and easily insulted. They might braid a horse's mane into impossible knots, or swap a healthy infant for a changeling with hollow eyes. Farmers swore that if you heard laughter in the field at twilight, it was wise to look busy and not answer. The polite fiction was that fairies hated rudeness, but the truth was simpler. People hated coincidences they couldn't explain. Some regions believed in house spirits who kept the home running when humans were asleep. In Scotland, he was a brownie. In Germany, a kobold. In Scandinavia, a Nisa. Feed him porridge and he'd sweep the floor. Forget his supper and he'd hurl crockery at your head. The arrangement was both superstition and early labor outsourcing. The invisible workforce never asked for pay, just appreciation and a clean bowl. The woods, of course, belonged to stranger things. Travelers told of will-o'-the-wisps, small floating lights that lured wanderers into swamps. Scholars suggested gases from rotting plants. Peasants preferred the explanation that lost souls carried lanterns looking for their way home. Either way, the advice was clear: stay on the path. If a light danced where no man should be, it was curiosity's way of checking your life insurance. There were kinder spirits too. Springs and wells often had guardians, maidens of water who rewarded courtesy with clear, healing drink. Leave an offering, usually a coin or a ribbon, and your luck improved. Dump your laundry in the holy spring, and you'd risk mysterious skin rashes or worse, a scolding from the local priest. Medieval life required constant diplomacy with nature. Even the air had moods. Sudden whirlwinds were blamed on invisible creatures rushing past. If a storm flattened your crops, people said a witch had flown through. Nobody blamed atmospheric pressure. That concept hadn't been invented yet. Instead, everything became personal. The wind, the rain, the forest, the moon. The world wasn't a machine, it was a conversation, and silence was never truly silent. Over time, churchmen tried to domesticate these stories, folding them into sermons about temptation or virtue. But the folk beliefs proved stubborn. They comforted people more reliably than doctrine. It's hard to excommunicate a superstition when it's also your bedtime story. So the fairies stayed. They survived sermons, plagues, and printing presses. Even today, in rural corners of Europe, road builders hesitate before cutting through a fairy hill. The medieval imagination, it seems, still owns a few acres of real estate. Curses, charms, and everyday magic. For people in the Middle Ages, luck was a currency that fluctuated daily. A good harvest, an easy childbirth, a healthy cow, none of it could be taken for granted. So they armed themselves with charms and blessings, small portable shields against a world that loves surprise. Magic wasn't a hobby for sorcerers in towers. It was the practical toolkit of ordinary survival. Most households had a collection of charms tucked into pockets or nailed above doors. A sprig of rowan kept away evil spirits. A horseshoe hung points up, trapped luck like water in a cup. If your neighbor's gaze lingered a little too long on your thriving garden, you muttered a protective rhyme to ward off the envy. Envy, after all, was contagious. It could wither vegetables faster than drought. At least that's what everyone agreed. The boundary between medicine and magic was barely visible. Herbalists, usually women, knew hundreds of remedies. Foxglove for heart problems, willow bark for pain, and mugwort for pretty much everything else. They whispered Latin prayers over the mixtures, not because the herbs needed encouragement, but because their customers did. A little ceremony made the cure feel official. If the patient recovered, faith had worked. If not, well, perhaps the charm had been performed on the wrong day of the moon. Timing mattered enormously. Certain rituals only function when the stars formed favorable angles, or when church bells marked particular hours. A charm spoken at dusk carried more weight than one muttered at noon. The logic was simple. Powerful moments required powerful timing. You didn't bother the supernatural during lunch. Travelers carried pocket protection, lead crosses, saint medals, bits of parchment with sacred words. Even literate men rarely understood the inscriptions. The letters themselves were thought to hold power. The word wasn't just symbol, it was substance. If you owned the right phrase, written by the right hand, the universe listened. There were darker versions of these practices: curses, hexes, whispered threats carved into wood or clay. Most began as petty revenge: a broken love, a stolen chicken, an insult at the tavern. People mixed soot with spit, scratched names backward, and buried the results in crossroads. The spell itself didn't have to make sense. What mattered was the feeling of control. When your life depended on weather and disease, even the illusion of power was a kind of therapy. The church predictably disapproved. Official prayers were fine, homemade ones were suspicious. Yet priests themselves used holy water, relics, and protective blessings that looked suspiciously like magic with better branding. A saint's bone could heal the sick. A fragment of the true cross could guard a whole village. The difference between faith and sorcery was mainly who signed the paperwork. Some charms wandered into comedy. People carried dried toads in tiny bags for courage, or wore bits of iron to prevent fairies from stealing them. A few ambitious souls tried to summon treasure spirits who promised gold in exchange for lifelong piety. Predictably, the gold never arrived, and the spirits failed to provide refunds. Still, beneath the superstition lay something touching. These rituals were built on hope, the belief that the universe might listen if you spoke the right words with enough sincerity. Every knot tied, every candle lit, every whisper into the night was a small declaration of will. I'm still here, and I want things to be better. Magic in the medieval sense was less about defying nature and more about negotiating with it, a bargain between fear and faith. And when it worked, when the fever broke or the rain finally came, it felt like proof that the world, however mysterious, could sometimes be persuaded to show mercy. The dark art of witchcraft. In the Middle Ages, witchcraft was less a profession and more a rumor that could end your life. The word witch covered everything from a lonely widow with too many cats to a healer whose herbs worked a little too well. The medieval world was full of anxiety about crops, storms, sickness, and people preferred a face to blame rather than an invisible cause. When misfortune arrived, someone always fit the costume. Early on, witchcraft wasn't automatically evil. Folk healers, sometimes called cunning men or wise women, made potions, read charms, and located lost property. They blended Christian prayer with older pagan habits, calling on saints one moment and river spirits the next. The community tolerated them as long as their work stayed useful. Nobody cared where the magic came from as long as it fixed a cow or a broken heart. By the late 14th century, church authorities began to notice that some of these charms borrowed theology without permission. They called it heresy dressed in herbs. Manuals for inquisitors began to circulate, turning folklore into evidence. A woman with strange powders, a man who whispered to the wind, anyone who lived alone. Suddenly, they were a potential headline act for Satan. The transformation of the healer into the witch was slow, bureaucratic, and depressingly efficient. Contrary to modern myth, medieval Europe wasn't drowning in witch hunts. That came later during the Renaissance when people were supposed to be getting smarter, but seeds were planted early. superstition grew alongside authority. If you believed angels could visit shepherds, it wasn't a stretch to imagine demons visiting shepherds too. Every miracle required an equal opposite. The universe loves symmetry. The accusations usually followed patterns. Livestock died, beer soured, a baby fell ill. Someone whispered a name. The accused was questioned, often gently at first until the questions turned creative. Confessions were collected like stamps, each one reinforcing the next. It was less about truth and more about theater, the community exercising its fear in public. The tools of witchcraft were rarely dramatic. No bubbling cauldrons or midnight orgies, just kitchen items and wild plants. Mandrake roots, belladonna, wolfsbane, henbane. The medieval medicine cabinet was also a poison shop. Some of these herbs could numb pain or cause hallucinations. A flying ointment, for example, might make you believe you were soaring through the night when you were merely lying in a field, half poisoned and fully convinced. Imagination filled in what chemistry began. For those accused, the best defense was social capital. A respected midwife might be spared. A disliked beggar had no chance. Trials were less about evidence and more about who the village could live without. Sometimes the accused escaped by humor or wit. Records mention women answering inquisitors with absurd stories, knowing that mockery might confuse fear long enough to survive. There's dark courage in that, fighting terror with laughter. Witchcraft symbolized the tension between knowledge and ignorance. The healer and the heretic often shared the same herbs, the same prayers, and sometimes the same fate. The real threat wasn't magic. It was the reminder that control was an illusion. Every time a candle guttered or a child coughed, the line between science and superstition flickered again. In the end, witchcraft in the Middle Ages was less about pacts with devils and more about people struggling to feel powerful in a world that wasn't. The cauldron, the broom, the whispered spell, all small rebellions against helplessness. And that's why the idea never vanished. Every age invents its witches. They're just reflections of who we fear and sometimes who we envy. Saints, relics, and the business of holiness. For all the talk of devils and curses, the medieval world ran mostly on faith, and faith had an economy. Saints were its celebrity endorsers, and relics were the merchandise. Bones, scraps of cloth, even the occasional vial of alleged saintly blood, all sold the idea that holiness could be touched, carried, and, for the right donation, borrowed. A small church might advertise a saint's finger. A large cathedral might claim half a skeleton. Rival towns sometimes discovered matching sets of the same saint, an impressive logistical feat considering how few bones an average human body contained. Pilgrims didn't mind. Belief thrives on supply. Pilgrimage itself was the medieval version of long-form therapy. Walk far enough, pray often enough, and your sins might lighten. The roads across Europe filled with travelers seeking shrines at Canterbury, Santiago, Rome, or local holy wells that promised smaller miracles at shorter distances. Inns and vendors followed like moths to spiritual flame, selling candles, badges, and hot meals to the weary faithful. It was religion with a catering department. Relics worked as portable miracles. Touch one and divine favor might rub off like glitter. Some were authentic, bones of martyrs, or fragments from catacombs, but many were creative substitutions. A church in France claimed a feather from the Archangel Gabriel. Another displayed the Virgin Mary's comb. One unfortunate abbey owned several teeth of St. John the Baptist, suggesting the saint had the dental structure of a shark. Still, relics mattered because they made heaven tangible. In a world where medicine faltered and war was constant, people needed physical proof that goodness had substance. A relic reminded you that the line between divine and human could blur in your favor. Kneeling before a splinter of the true cross felt safer than trusting luck alone. The relic trade turned piety into commerce. Relic sellers traveled like modern marketers, carrying ornate boxes and convincing smiles. They offered indulgences, spiritual coupons promising time off purgatory for generous contributions. The wealthy built chapels to house their collections. The poor saved pennies to glimpse them once in a lifetime. Faith became both spectacle and currency, and nobody saw a contradiction. Monks, the quiet custodians of holiness, were also expert accountants. Pilgrims brought money, money built monasteries, and monasteries funded scriptoria that copied more stories about saints performing miracles. It was a tidy feedback loop. Miracle inspires pilgrimage. Pilgrimage funds miracle publicity. Even skepticism had limits. A few scholars questioned the authenticity of relics, only to be reminded that doubt was bad for business and possibly for their health. Better to smile, light a candle, and admire the craftsmanship of Saint Whoever's shinbone. Humor aside, relics held a deep psychological truth. They were anchors of meaning. Each fragment stood for hope that the sacred could intervene in daily mess. Whether real or not, they gave shape to longing. A mother praying over a child's fever didn't care about providence. She cared about mercy. In the grand market of medieval belief, relics were the most human of products. Objects built from desperation, imagination, and a little holy marketing. They proved that faith, when mixed with enterprise, could move both hearts and coin purses. Monsters, myths, and the edges of the map. If you were a medieval traveler, you didn't need to go far to meet something terrifying. The world beyond the next hill was rumored to crawl with creatures that never made it into the biology textbooks. The further from civilization you went, the stranger things became. Every empty horizon was a canvas for fear and imagination. Maps from the era tell the story best. In the blank spaces beyond known towns, cartographers sketched warnings. Serpents, dragons, fish the size of ships. "Here be monsters," they'd write, as if labeling your nightmares could keep them from crawling ashore. Geography blended with theology. Unknown lands were assumed to house the unholy. Travelers' tales poured in from merchants, sailors, and soldiers, each one more ambitious than the last. Someone claimed to have seen dog-headed men in the east, tribes of one-footed people who shaded themselves with their enormous souls, and islands where giants roasted humans on spits. Scholars dutifully recorded all of it. The medieval imagination preferred wild possibilities to dull reality. Not every creature was evil. Some were symbols, moral fables disguised as wildlife. The unicorn represented purity, so elusive it could only be captured by a virgin. The basilisk embodied deadly sin, able to kill with a glance. The phoenix stood for resurrection, always helpful in a sermon about hope. The bestiary, part encyclopedia and part parable, cataloged them with the same seriousness modern scientists reserve for lab notes. Then there were dragons, Europe's emotional support monsters. They appeared everywhere, from Norse sagas to English legends, always hoarding something valuable and burning villages for fun. They symbolized chaos, greed, and the constant medieval suspicion that the universe was rigged against you. Every saint worth their halo fought at least one dragon, proof that faith could torch fear if you swung hard enough. The ocean, vast and unmapped, bred its own folklore. Sailors swore by sea serpents with eyes like lanterns, whales mistaken for islands, and sirens whose songs were either dangerously beautiful or just very misleading marketing. When a ship vanished, no one blamed navigation. They blamed krakens. It was easier to accept being swallowed by a monster than by miscalculation. The church often tolerated these myths, even used them. Monsters at the world's edge reminded believers that God's creation had limits, and that stepping too far from Christendom led to both moral and geographical peril. It was theology disguised as travel advice. Still, belief in monsters wasn't pure superstition. It was also an early attempt to explain diversity. When medieval Europeans encountered new cultures, they filtered difference through myth. People with unfamiliar customs became monstrous races. It was ignorance with a creative flair, turning anthropology into fantasy. Yet the real fascination lay in the idea that the world was incomplete. Those margins on maps weren't terrifying because they contained monsters. They were terrifying because they represented everything humans didn't know. The medieval mind lived in a state of wonder and dread, two sides of the same candle flame. And honestly, the monsters made life more interesting. A farmer's daily grind of mud and taxes was easier to bear when you believed that somewhere out there, dragons still breathed fire and heroes still fought them. Folklore filled the silence of long nights, giving shape to fear, courage, and the small hope that maybe the world held more than what you could see. Death, ghosts, and the restless dead. In medieval Europe, death was the most reliable neighbor. Plague, famine, war, childbirth all worked together to keep the population modest. People lived with mortality the way modern folks live with weather forecasts. Inconvenient, predictable, and sometimes catastrophic. It's no surprise that the line between life and afterlife blurred into an ongoing conversation. The church promised an orderly process: death, judgment, heaven, or hell. But ordinary people weren't convinced it was that neat. Between those destinations lingered a messy middle ground where spirits wandered, unfinished business clinging like mud. Ghost stories weren't entertainment. They were moral lessons wrapped in chills. Medieval ghosts tended to be bureaucratic. They returned not to terrify, but to settle accounts. A spirit might appear to confess unpaid debts, request prayers, or reveal hidden sins. If you'd wronged someone, you might expect a spectral audit. It was divine bookkeeping with extra drama. Parish priests encouraged the idea. It kept the living humble and the dead busy. The most famous hauntings involved monasteries. Monks recorded tales of fellow brothers rising from graves to complain about minor infractions, miscounted rosaries, broken vows, borrowed cloaks never returned. You could almost admire their commitment to administrative accuracy beyond death. These stories were meant to reassure. Purgatory was working. The system still cared. But not all ghosts were patient. Some howled through night winds, trapped by sudden death or crime. The medieval imagination gave them form: pale figures with burning eyes, skeletons carrying their own coffins, and women in shrouds wandering crossroads. Every region had a variation. The Irish had banshees, the English had churchyard specters, the French had revenants. You could travel across Europe and meet death speaking every language. The Black Death in the 14th century intensified the obsession. When a third of your world vanishes in a few months, theology bends under the weight. Art filled with skeletons dancing, grim yet weirdly festive, reminding survivors that the party ends for everyone eventually. The dance of death motif marched through murals, manuscripts, even carvings on church doors. It wasn't just morbid humor, it was a survival mechanism. Laugh at death and maybe it won't take you too seriously. Graveyards became social spaces. People picnicked among tombs, markets popped up near charnel houses, and bones were rearranged into art. Ossuaries, bone chapels, turned mortality into architecture. The message was blunt but comforting. Everyone ends up the same, no matter how shiny your armor or how many relics you collected. Folk rituals tried to keep the dead content. Bells were rung at funerals to drive off spirits lurking for company. Candles burned all night to guide the soul toward peace. And families left food offerings for wandering relatives. Christianity provided official prayers, but local superstition added insurance policies, salt on thresholds, herbs in coffins, doors left slightly open so souls could leave politely. Some believed the dead got returned not just as ghosts but as physical corpses, the dreaded revenants. These were the ancestors of the vampire myth, bloated, ruddy, and too fond of night walks. Villagers sometimes dug up graves, found natural decomposition they didn't understand, and assumed the worst. The cure was direct: decapitation, burning, or staking. Practical, if not exactly scientific. Death's familiarity made the living strangely resilient. When mortality sits at your table daily, you stop pretending it won't. Medieval people joked about it, painted it, sang about it. Fear became ritual, ritual became comfort. And maybe beneath the superstition, that was the point: to make peace with the inevitable through stories that gave shape to the dark. The Devil's Playground: Temptation and Sin in Daily Life. To live in the Middle Ages was to believe that the devil never took a day off. He was the original workaholic, prowling every shadow, whispering into ears, tripping farmers into muddy puddles, and tempting monks with thoughts far from holy. Sin wasn't an abstract concept, it was a daily hazard, like catching a cold for your own soul. The church spent centuries cataloging sin with the precision of an accountant. Pride, envy, wrath, sloth, greed, gluttony, lust. The famous 7 were just the highlights. Manuals for confessors read like medieval self-help books, explaining how each sin operated, what symptoms to watch for, and which prayers could disinfect the spirit. It was both moral guidance and early psychology, with guilt as the binding glue. Ordinary life offered endless chances to fall short. Farmers cheated weights at market. Soldiers drank too much and forgot their vows. Nobles extorted peasants, then built chapels to compensate. The tension between pleasure and piety ran through every social layer. It wasn't hypocrisy so much as survival, people trying to balance salvation with appetite. Temptation came in many disguises. For monks, it might appear as boredom, the demon of acedia, spiritual listlessness that made prayer feel like wading through mud. For merchants, it was greed. For villagers, gossip. Each failure became proof that the devil's marketing team was exceptional. Sermons painted him not as a roaring beast, but as a subtle negotiator who offered comfort in exchange for conscience. Art and literature reflected the obsession. The margins of illuminated manuscripts, those exquisite books copied by monks, are full of tiny demons pulling pranks, stealing ink pots, or mooning saints. It's as if the scribes themselves couldn't resist giving mischief a cameo. Even in devotion, humor found cracks to crawl through. Confession was the great equalizer. Everyone sinned, so everyone confessed. Priests heard the same stories on repeat: lies, envy, desire, and the occasional goat-related incident. For the faithful, the ritual offered relief, a reset button for the soul. For the clergy, it offered data, an ongoing survey of human weakness. You could almost chart the social trends of a village by its confessions. Women, predictably, were seen as more susceptible to temptation, an inheritance from Eve that medieval theologians never got over. Any woman who dressed too brightly, laughed too freely, or owned a book risked commentary about her moral fragility. Yet the same culture adored the Virgin Mary, the ultimate symbol of purity. The contradiction was massive, but few seemed bothered. Theology has always been comfortable with double standards. Still, medieval people didn't live crushed under guilt all the time. They joked about sin the way people now joke about taxes, inevitable, mildly absurd, occasionally devastating. Carnival festivals flipped morality on its head, letting villagers wear masks, drink heavily, and mock authority before returning to obedience the next day. Even the church tolerated it, better a scheduled outburst than a real rebellion. At its heart, the obsession with sin wasn't about cruelty, but about control. The world was unpredictable, and moral order gave it shape. If drought came, it wasn't random, it was punishment. If rain came, it was forgiveness. Every event became a dialogue between heaven and humanity. Superstition, yes, but also a kind of poetry. The belief that everything mattered, that even your smallest choices rippled into eternity. And despite all the sermons and scare tactics, people remained gloriously human, imperfect, curious, and occasionally defiant. The devil may have had plenty of customers, but heaven, for all its bureaucracy, never quite lost the competition. The church, power, and everyday control. If the medieval world were a machine, the church was the engine, massive, indispensable, and occasionally leaking oil. It governed birth to burial with more reach than any king. You entered life through baptism, married under its gaze, confessed your thoughts to its servants, and left this world wrapped in its prayers. There wasn't much room to opt out. Power came from information and ritual. The church controlled both. Most people couldn't read, and books were luxury items that cost as much as livestock. The clergy held the keys to literacy, which meant they held the keys to law, contracts, and salvation itself. Latin was the gatekeeper's language. The rest of the world had to trust the translation. Every village church doubled as courtroom, social hub, and rumor mill. Bells dictated daily rhythm, work, prayer, curfew. The calendar revolved around saints' days and feast days, which were conveniently plentiful. It wasn't all solemnity. Some festivals included drinking contests, miracle plays, and parades that looked suspiciously pagan under their Christian paint. The church tolerated it, knowing that joy kept people obedient better than fear alone. Tithes, the mandatory tax for God's upkeep, were due annually, 10% of everything you produced. Refuse, and you risked both excommunication and social exile. The irony of paying the local priest more than your landlord wasn't lost on peasants, but open complaint could land you in serious trouble. Faith might save your soul, but it also emptied your grain bins. The clergy itself was a patchwork of saints, scholars, and opportunists. Some priests genuinely served their flocks, feeding the poor and teaching literacy. Others treated the priesthood like a family business, collecting donations, fathering unofficial children, and living well on divine credit. Reform movements rose and fell, always trying to drag the institution back to humility. It's difficult to preach poverty from a golden pulpit. Monasteries were the intellectual heart of the age. Behind thick stone walls, monks copied manuscripts by candlelight, preserving ancient texts that would have otherwise vanished. Their silence wasn't just devotion, it was also efficient. You get a lot more writing done when no one's talking. Still, they weren't ascetic robots. Monks brewed beer, made cheese, and occasionally rebelled against their own abbots. Human nature, like yeast, always finds a way to rise. At higher levels, bishops and popes played politics like seasoned diplomats. The church crowned emperors, blessed invasions, and brokered peace when convenient. Excommunication was the nuclear option, a spiritual death sentence that turned kings into beggars overnight. Imagine being told heaven had revoked your access privileges. Few risked defiance for long. Yet even this vast authority couldn't exist without public belief. The system worked because people wanted it to. In a chaotic world, the church offered meaning and order. Every ritual was a reminder that life wasn't random, that suffering served a purpose, that heaven was real, and that someone somewhere was keeping moral score. Not everyone bought it. Quiet heresies brewed among merchants and scholars who read too widely or asked too many questions. But questioning dogma was dangerous sport. The inquisitors were efficient, if not imaginative. Many thinkers chose discretion over martyrdom. Still, the paradox stood. A church that preached humility but wielded enormous wealth, that promised peace but waged crusades, that condemned superstition but sold relics by the cartload. The medieval mind tolerated contradiction because it was normal. Everything about life was tangled. And despite its flaws, the church kept knowledge alive through centuries that might have otherwise drowned in darkness. It was a flawed guardian of civilization, but a guardian nonetheless. Love, marriage, and the medieval heart. Romance in the Middle Ages wasn't candlelight and poetry. It was mostly economics with a side of obligation. Marriage joined land before it joined hearts. For nobles, a wedding was a treaty in disguise. For peasants, it was a labor arrangement with some optional affection. Still, love found ways to sneak in through the cracks, humming in songs and whispering through castle walls. Among the upper classes, matchmaking was political chess. A baron might promise his daughter to a rival's son to end a feud or to secure a piece of territory. The bride's consent was technically required, but conveniently interpreted. Once vows were spoken and sealed with a dowry, the union was less about companionship and more about producing heirs to keep estates intact. Romance was a luxury that came after survival, if it came at all. Peasant marriages were humbler but freer. Young couples met at markets, harvest festivals, or churchyards, where flirtation looked a lot like teasing with pitchforks. Parents usually had opinions, but affection mattered more than rank. Villagers couldn't afford the drama of dynastic politics. They needed partners who could share chores, not thrones. Even so, weddings were communal spectacles. Dancing, ale, and the occasional fistfight over who'd caught the bride's garter. The church took marriage very seriously. Once you said "I do," it was permanent divine glue. Divorce was nearly impossible. Annulments existed but required money and influence. This made for some spectacularly miserable households, the kind that inspired wandering minstrels to write songs about love that could never be. The poets of courtly love, mostly French, invented a fantasy world where knights adored unattainable ladies, praising their beauty and virtue while gallantly never touching them. It was emotional tourism for people trapped in arranged marriages. Courtly love spread like perfume, intoxicating, impractical, and slightly ridiculous. Troubadours sang about hearts aflame, queens sighed from balconies, and everyone pretended this was a noble form of suffering rather than a medieval crush. It wasn't about consummation, but about longing itself, an ideal of refinement and restraint that civilized the rough edges of feudal life. You could pine nobly and still keep your title. Meanwhile, the church tried to police intimacy. Premarital relations were sinful adultery scandalous, and anything unconventional downright demonic. Yet the same sermons that condemned desire also obsessed over it in microscopic detail. Priests wrote manuals explaining which acts were allowed, when, and for what purpose. They turned the human body into a theological puzzle. You can imagine the confusion. Women's roles in love were paradoxical, exalted as pure maidens or condemned as temptresses, rarely treated as people with mixed emotions and agency. Still, some found ways to bend the rules. Widows who inherited land gained unusual freedom, and a few managed estates, ran businesses, even arranged marriages for others. In the cracks of patriarchy, competence grew quietly. For all its regulation, affection thrived in daily life. Couples exchanged tokens, a ribbon, a lock of hair, a simple wooden ring. Love letters survived, scrawled in uneven Latin or vernacular tongues, full of hope and clumsy spelling. They proved that even in a world obsessed with sin and salvation, humans still risk tenderness. Then the troubadours eventually faded, but their songs left a lasting trace. The idea that love should be both passionate and virtuous, chaotic and noble. Medieval marriage was practical, but the heart always wanted something wilder. And that tension between duty and desire still beats in every romance centuries later. Feasts, fasts, and the strange taste of the medieval table eating in the Middle Ages was equal parts survival and spectacle. The upper classes treated dining as theater, while peasants treated it as luck. What ended up on your plate depended entirely on who you were, where you lived, and how many saints you'd bribed that year. For most villagers, the menu was repetitive and beige. Bread made from barley or rye, thick pottage of oats or peas, maybe a bit of onion or cabbage if the harvest hadn't failed. Meat was rare. Salt pork or fish showed up on feast days like minor miracles. Water wasn't always safe, so ale, weak, cloudy, and surprisingly nutritious, was a national beverage from toddlerhood onward. Everyone lived slightly buzzed, which probably made serfdom easier to tolerate. In contrast, the nobility turned meals into social choreography. A medieval feast was less about nourishment and more about hierarchy. Guests were seated by rank, not by personality, and dishes arrived in theatrical waves, roasted peacocks with gilded feathers reattached, pies that released live birds when cut open, swans, boars, and anything large enough to brag about. Servants circulated with trenchers, flat slabs of stale bread used as plates. When the meal ended, those bread plates went to the poor, soggy but charitable. Spices were the true currency of status. Pepper, cinnamon, saffron, and cloves traveled thousands of miles and cost more than silver. Nobles seasoned everything as if they were trying to prove their tongues were richer than their souls. Contrary to myth, they didn't use spices to hide spoiled meat. They used them to flaunt global reach. A stew heavy with cloves said, "I have connections in Alexandria, you do not." The church regulated appetite with a zeal that would shame modern nutritionists. Fasting days covered nearly half the calendar, banning meat but allowing fish, because apparently fish didn't count as flesh in heaven's accounting system. This led to creative menu stretching. Beavers were declared fish since they had tails and lived in water. No one argued too hard. Everyone wanted to keep their stew. Dining etiquette manuals reveal a fascinating blend of manners and menace. Don't pick your teeth with your knife. Don't blow your nose on the tablecloth. Don't lick your fingers before the bishop finishes his grace. The rules were endless and often ignored after the third cup of wine. Feasts could turn chaotic, dogs underfoot, minstrels performing loudly, and as someone inevitably falling asleep in the gravy. Peasants, meanwhile, celebrated simpler joys. Harvest festivals featured shared bread, local beer, and roasted anything. These gatherings blurred class lines for a night. Lords and laborers danced in the same fields, briefly united by drunkenness and exhaustion. Food was a language everyone spoke fluently. There were odd delicacies too: hedgehog stew, songbird pie, jelly made from eel, and blank manger, a kind of medieval chicken pudding that sounds like a dare. Sweet and savory, blurred without shame. Sugar was a luxury, used sparingly, but honey and dried fruit sweetened most desserts. The combination of meat, sugar, and vinegar gave the cuisine its peculiar tang, somewhere between adventure and regret. The smell of the medieval kitchen was part heaven, part hazard: open fires, boiling cauldrons, and smoke thick enough to cure a ham just by standing there. Yet those smoky halls were also the heart of community. To share food, however rough or refined, was to affirm life against uncertainty. Eating was rarely just eating. It was ritual, politics, comfort, and art. Whether gnawing crusts in a cottage or carving swan at a banquet, everyone understood the same truth. Tomorrow's meal was never guaranteed, and that made every crumb, every swallow, a quiet prayer of thanks. Medicine, disease, and the art of staying alive. The medieval world wasn't short on faith, but it was desperately short on penicillin. To get sick was to enter a strange mixture of theology, guesswork, and hope. Medicine stood somewhere between superstition and science, a profession where you might find monks, barbers, and astrologers all claiming to know what made humans fall apart. The most important medical theory was the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health doctors believed was a matter of keeping these fluids in balance. Too much black bile made you melancholic, too much yellow bile made you angry, too much phlegm made you dull, and too much blood made you lively to the point of danger. Treatment often meant removing something by bleeding, purging, or letting nature work it out while you prayed. It was half chemistry, half plumbing, with a touch of medieval optimism. Hospitals did exist, though they weren't quite what the word suggests today. Most were extensions of monasteries, places to care for the poor and dying rather than cure them. Nurses were usually nuns, physicians were rare, and miracles were the preferred prescription. Cleanliness was hit or miss. Some wards doubled as pilgrim hostels, and bed sharing was a given. Still, the compassion was genuine. Healing the body was considered an act of mercy, even if the body didn't always cooperate. Doctors, when available, were a mixed blessing. The educated ones studied at universities like Salerno or Montpellier, where they read ancient Greek and Arabic medical texts, especially those of Galen and Avicenna. These books were brilliant but centuries old, describing anatomy largely by imagination. Dissection was frowned upon, so knowledge advanced by creative interpretation. If a treatment failed, the patient's sin was blamed, not the science. The less educated healers were often more practical. Herbalists, midwives, and barber surgeons treated wounds, delivered babies, and pulled teeth. Their medicine came from experience rather than theory, though they risked accusations of witchcraft if they were too successful. Barber surgeons were especially brave, or reckless. Between haircuts, they performed bloodletting, amputations, and dental extractions, often with the same knife. It was efficient, if unsanitary. Then came the plague, capital P. The Black Death arrived in 1347 and rewrote the rules of life. It swept across Europe like a biblical punishment, killing with stunning speed. Some cities lost half their people in a season. Doctors wore bird-beaked masks stuffed with herbs, believing the scent would filter out corruption. The sight of those masks probably did more to scare off illness than cure it. Treatments ranged from bathing in vinegar to pressing cut onions against the skin. Unsurprisingly, results were inconsistent. The psychological fallout was immense. When medicine failed, people turned to religion, then panic, then violence. Flagellants roamed towns, whipping themselves to earn God's mercy. Others blamed minorities, outsiders, or witches. Reason collapsed under fear, and the only winners were gravediggers. Yet even amid the horror, knowledge advanced quietly. Records of symptoms, quarantine measures, and sanitation efforts laid the foundation for later medicine. Progress born from disaster. Everyday ailments were less dramatic but constant. Fevers, toothaches, infections. Pain was normal. Endurance, a virtue. Remedies mixed herbs like rosemary, sage, and yarrow with ritual prayers. Astrology also had a say. Surgery under the wrong star could doom a patient, or so it was believed. The sky was both clock and diagnostic tool, and still people survived. Against all odds, they patched, bled, and prayed themselves into another dawn. The body, fragile and stubborn, kept dragging the species forward. For all the leeches, incense, and divine speculation, medieval medicine had one unshakable principle. Life, no matter how crude its care, was worth preserving. Work, craft, and the rhythm of labor. To be alive in the Middle Ages meant to work, constantly, predictably, and often painfully. Leisure was for saints, nobles, or the dead. Everyone else spent their lives pushing against time, weather, and obligation. Yet within that grind was a rhythm that gave meaning to existence, a pulse of seasons and toil that stitched communities together more tightly than any crown or creed could. The medieval economy ran on muscle. Plows carved mud, hands spun wool, hammers rang against anvils. A peasant's day began with sunrise and ended when darkness made tools useless. Fields didn't wait for inspiration. You plowed when the soil allowed, sowed when the weather cooperated, harvested before the Lord's steward arrived to take his share. Productivity wasn't optional. It was survival under contract. Feudalism organized work with the efficiency of a food chain. The king owned everything in theory. The nobles owned it in practice. The peasants worked it in reality. In return for protection, an arrangement as reassuring as an umbrella in a hurricane, villagers owed labor, taxes, and loyalty. But life wasn't all servitude. Shared hardship built kinship. Harvest festivals, shared ovens, and cooperative threshing bound villages into small republics of necessity. Craftsmen lived slightly freer lives inside towns. The blacksmith, carpenter, weaver, and tanner turned raw materials into civilization. Their guilds, part union, part mafia, part social club, set prices, trained apprentices, and guarded trade secrets like medieval NDAs. To join a guild meant belonging to something larger than yourself. You learn your craft from adolescence, slept above your tools and dreamed in the smell of iron, wood, or dye. Apprenticeship was education by endurance. A boy might spend 7 years fetching, sweeping, and observing before being trusted with real work. Girls trained in textiles, brewing, or domestic service, often supporting households or running market stalls. Skill was currency. A good blacksmith could feed his family. A bad one starved politely. The tools of labor were simple but clever. A plow's design varied by region. The heavy-wheeled plow of Northern Europe transformed clay soil into farmland, fueling population growth. Watermills and windmills multiplied human effort, grinding grain, sawing timber, and even powering early industrial devices. The sound of turning millstones was the heartbeat of prosperity. Yet labor wasn't purely drudgery. There was pride in craft. A mason carving a gargoyle knew it would outlive him. A weaver saw beauty in her patterns long before anyone else did. The anonymous artisans who built cathedrals left their signatures not in names but in stone that still catches light the same way 8 centuries later. Work for them was both prayer and proof of existence. The calendar shaped everything. Spring meant planting, summer, labor, autumn, harvest, winter, endurance. Holy days punctuated the grind, dozens of them, offering brief reprieve under the watchful eyes of saints. On those days, the same hands that reaped grain would juggle, sing, or play games. Joy was rationed but real. Children worked early, old age came soon, and illness was a co-worker no one could fire. Still, medieval people found satisfaction in doing something well. They valued craft and cooperation more than wealth, mostly because wealth was unreachable. Work defined worth, and in that, there was dignity. To modernize, their lives looked brutal, but to them, work was structure, not punishment. Every swing of a hammer, every furrowed row, every thread spun was a statement of defiance against chaos. The world might be unfair, but you could still make something that lasted. In that small truth, they built a civilization. Crime, punishment, and the public spectacle of justice in the Middle Ages wasn't blind. It was loud, visible, and occasionally on fire. Law existed to maintain order, not fairness, and most people understood that before they could even spell gallows. Courts, trials, and punishments were designed less to reform the guilty and more to remind everyone else to behave. It worked in a grim sort of way. Crime came in predictable flavors: theft, assault, adultery, heresy, witchcraft, and the ever-popular insulting authority. Punishments ranged from fines to dismemberment, depending on your social class and the mood of whoever held the whip. Steal a loaf of bread as a peasant, and you might lose a hand. Steal a castle as a baron, and you might gain a promotion. The scales of justice were balanced mostly by irony. In villages, justice began at the manorial court. The lord or his steward presided, peasants gathered, and disputes were aired publicly. You might be fined for letting your pigs wander or for brewing bad ale. Those courts were as much about community policing as law. Gossip often carried more weight than evidence. If you denied a charge, you could call oath helpers to swear to your honesty. It was less CSI, more who's willing to vouch for Bob. For serious crimes, royal or ecclesiastical courts took over. Here, trials turned theatrical. Ordeals, literally tests of divine judgment, were common. A suspect might hold a red-hot iron or plunge a hand into boiling water. If the wound healed cleanly, God had spoken. Innocence confirmed. If it festered, well, that was divine feedback too. There were also ordeals by combat, where two parties fought it out under the belief that heaven would favor the righteous. Unsurprisingly, the strong often turned out holier than the weak. The church ran its own brand of justice. Clerics accused of wrongdoing claimed benefit of clergy, meaning they'd be tried by ecclesiastical courts, which preferred penance to punishment. Recite a psalm correctly, and you might walk free. Ordinary people quickly learned the verse, which didn't impress the authorities for long. Punishment was public theater. Stocks and pillories turned humiliation into community entertainment. Flogging, branding, and mutilation were meant to make examples, not corpses. But when deterrence required drama, executions became civic festivals. Hangings drew crowds, merchants, and food vendors. Children climbed shoulders to see better. The condemned often delivered last speeches, sometimes defiant, sometimes desperate. Gallows humor wasn't just a phrase, it was survival instinct. Beheadings were considered noble, burning heretics a religious duty, and drawing and quartering reserved for high treason. The creativity of pain had no shortage of imagination. But even here, medieval people saw justice as moral correction, not mere cruelty. The spectacle reaffirmed a shared belief that sin and crime disrupted cosmic order, and that order could be restored through punishment. Yet beneath the blood and ceremony, a slow evolution was happening. By the 13th century, written laws, professional judges, and legal precedents began shaping something resembling modern justice. Magna Carta forced even kings to acknowledge limits. Town charters established rights for citizens, however narrow. Juries replaced ordeals, reasoning began to edge out superstition, and the rule of law, imperfect but growing, began to take root. Still, fear was the strongest lawman. The idea that divine eyes watched every act, that sin and crime were interchangeable, kept more people honest than any sheriff could. When justice failed, vengeance filled the gap. Feuds could last generations, kept alive by memory and ale. The peace of the realm was fragile, but people clung to it because the alternative was chaos. By the close of the medieval age, justice had started to look less like revenge and more like administration. Bureaucracy replaced spectacle. Parchment replaced pyres. Yet the echoes remained. Every courtroom, every law, every plea for fairness owes something to those rough beginnings in the market square, where the crowd gathered to watch right and wrong wrestle in public, and where everyone learned that justice, like everything else, depends on who's holding the sword. War, knights, and the theater of valor. If the Middle Ages had a soundtrack, it would be the clash of metal and the prayer that came before it. War was constant background noise, a political argument expressed in sword strokes. Everyone from peasants to kings lived under its shadow, and yet somehow they romanticized it. They turned bloodshed into poetry, chaos into ceremony, and death into duty. Knighthood was the centerpiece of that illusion. The knight, shining and noble, has been polished by centuries of nostalgia. In reality, he was part athlete, part thug, part walking propaganda. Becoming one wasn't just about wielding a sword, it was about status. The ritual of knighthood was theatrical: vigils, oaths, blessings, and the symbolic tap of a sword. The church wrapped the whole business in sanctity, as if killing people became acceptable once you did it politely. A knight's armor was both protection and prison. A full suit could weigh up to 60 pounds, turning its wearer into a glittering tank powered by arrogance and muscle. It worked best on horseback, where the combination of height, metal, and momentum could crush a line of infantry like reeds. On foot, though, things got clumsy fast. Falling off your horse was embarrassing. Being too heavy to get back up was worse. Knights lived by the code of chivalry, which was equal parts moral compass and PR campaign. Honor, loyalty, piety, the usual virtues frequently ignored on the battlefield. They were supposed to defend the weak and respect women, but the weak rarely agreed on that assessment, and the women were often kidnapped for ransom. Still, the code gave war a vocabulary of virtue, making it sound better in songs than it looked in mud. The peasants had no armor, no poetry, and no choice. When war came, they provided food, taxes, or bodies. Armies were raised quickly. Men were summoned by feudal obligation or coin. Equipment was improvised. pitchforks, knives, anything that could hurt someone. Battles were short and terrifying, often lasting just a few hours, followed by days of looting and months of plague. Glory was for those who survived to write the chronicle. Sieges were the true art of medieval war. Castles were expensive to build and harder to take. A well-defended fortress could hold out for months, turning warfare into a waiting game. Catapults hurled stones, dead animals, and occasionally messages. Tunnels were dug under walls, towers rolled across fields, boiling oil poured from battlements. When starvation did what swords couldn't, surrender followed, often mercifully, sometimes not. The church, ever pragmatic, tried to regulate violence. It introduced the peace and truce of God, declaring certain days and people off limits for fighting. It didn't always work, but it looked good in sermons. Crusades, meanwhile, turned religion into a passport for slaughter. Pilgrimage with weapons, indulgences for sins. It was theology's messiest crossover event. Knights went to the Holy Land for faith, plunder, or boredom, and Europe learned that holy wars make unholy prophets. Despite the bloodshed, warfare pushed innovation, better metallurgy, improved fortifications, new tactics. Necessity drove progress. Longbows from England, crossbows from Genoa, gunpowder from the East. Each changed the rules. By the late Middle Ages, the armored knight was already a relic, beautiful and obsolete, undone by peasants with ranged weapons and better aim. For all the misery it caused, war also shaped identity. Loyalty, bravery, and sacrifice became cultural ideals. Monarchs built legitimacy on conquest, and minstrels turned defeat into legend. Even peasants learned to measure time by campaigns, the year of the siege, the winter after the raid. Conflict was woven into memory itself. To modernize, medieval warfare looks barbaric. To them, it was divine arithmetic, God deciding who deserved to rule. Victory proved righteousness. Defeat meant repentance. It was absurd, tragic, and deeply human. Behind every shining knight was a muddy soldier. Behind every banner, a village burning. And yet somehow they kept singing about honor. Faith, fear, and the architecture of heaven. The medieval world was built on faith, not the quiet, private kind, but a faith that filled every corner of existence. To be born, to eat, to fall ill, to die, everything happened beneath the gaze of God. Religion wasn't part of life, it was life, the invisible skeleton holding everything upright. Church bells marked time, saints marked geography, and sin marked everyone else. From the moment you woke until the moment you stopped breathing, the church had a rule, ritual, or fee for it. People didn't question God's existence. They questioned his mood. A good harvest, a healthy child, or surviving winter could all be read as divine approval. Lightning, famine, or plague meant he'd checked the wrong box. Cathedrals were the skyscrapers of their time. Colossal, extravagant, and funded by guilt. Stone by stone, they rose across Europe. Monuments of faith and ego. Ordinary people hauled blocks for decades knowing they'd never see the roof completed. But to help build God's house was an investment in eternity. Inside, stained glass poured colored light like liquid heaven. The architecture wasn't just decoration, it was theology made visible. Pointed arches lifted the eye toward paradise. Soaring vaults made you feel small enough to listen. Every village had its church, every town its abbey. The church wasn't just a place of worship, it was a record office, a hospital, a school, and sometimes a prison. Monasteries preserved learning when the rest of Europe preferred swords. Monks copied manuscripts by hand, illuminating pages with gold leaf and patience bordering on sainthood. Libraries in those monasteries became the internet of their age. Slow, expensive, but full of questionable Latin sources. Faith governed the calendar. Life orbited around holy days, fasts, and feasts. Lent brought restraint, Easter brought relief, and saints' days brought excuses to party in the name of piety. Pilgrimage was the medieval equivalent of tourism, only with more blisters and fewer souvenirs. Walking hundreds of miles to touch a relic, the bone of a saint, a fragment of the true cross, or a suspiciously ordinary rock, was a way to cleanse sin and test devotion. Whole economies sprang up around relics, many of which were, let's say, creatively sourced. There were enough pieces of the true cross in circulation to build a modest ship. Religion offered comfort, but also control. The fear of damnation hung over everything. The church taught that sin was inescapable but forgivable for a price. Indulgences, tithes, confessions, penances, spiritual bookkeeping that conveniently doubled as revenue. Yet people believed with sincerity. Hell was real, heaven worth the effort, and purgatory a middle ground for those who couldn't quite decide. Art, music, and literature fed this cosmic worldview. Gregorian chants filled churches like the heartbeat of eternity. Painters depicted saints and sinners with moral precision, halos for the faithful, fire for everyone else. Every story, from miracle plays to morality tales, pointed toward salvation or ruin. Even humor carried theology. The devil was often portrayed as clumsy and ridiculous, a cosmic buffoon easily outwitted by clever peasants and persistent nuns. But faith wasn't just obedience. It was survival. In a world without reliable medicine, government, or weather forecasts, belief offered structure. It made sense of chaos. When everything could kill you, disease, famine, childbirth, politics, the promise of paradise was more than comfort. It was hope dressed in ritual. And for all the corruption and cruelty, the church also nurtured compassion. It built hospitals, sheltered orphans, fed the hungry, and kept scholarship alive. It was both tyrant and teacher, burden and beacon. People may have feared God, but they also loved him with the same intensity they feared the dark. By the end of the Middle Ages, cracks were forming, reformers were whispering, scholars were questioning, and the printing press was about to turn theology into an argument no one could control. But during those long centuries of faith and fear, humanity built cathedrals tall enough to make even doubt look small. Towns, trade, and the birth of the merchant. For centuries, Europe had been a patchwork of manors and mud. But by the later Middle Ages, something remarkable began to stir. Towns. They rose like islands from the sea of feudalism. Noisy, crowded, independent, and slightly suspicious to anyone who still thought the world should smell like plowed fields. If the countryside was timeless, the town was restless. Walls went up, markets opened, coins clinked. Trade turned everything upside down. Suddenly, wealth didn't have to come from land. It could come from movement, from knowing where wool was cheap and spices were dear. The merchant appeared, part explorer, part accountant, part gambler. He didn't pray for rain, he prayed for good winds and honest partners. Towns began as trading posts, often near rivers or crossroads. Merchants brought in cloth, salt, iron, furs, and whatever else could survive a rough cart ride. Markets became weekly fairs, then permanent centers of commerce. The smell was unforgettable. Livestock, bread, sweat, ale, and ambition. Coins jingled, minstrels sang, pickpockets prayed for distraction. The medieval marketplace was capitalism in its noisy infancy. These towns developed their own rules, often separate from feudal law. City air makes you free, the saying went, and it wasn't a metaphor. A serf who managed to live inside town walls for a year and a day could legally claim freedom. Lords hated it, but taxes spoke louder than outrage. Town charters granted self-governance in exchange for loyalty to the crown and a steady flow of coin. Bureaucracy was born, wrapped in wax seals and good handwriting. Guilds ran the show inside. Much like in the countryside, work was organized by craft. Bakers, butchers, masons, weavers. Each guild set quality standards, prices, and training systems. They sponsored religious festivals, cared for sick members, and made sure no outsider undercut the locals. It was both community and cartel. Apprentice, journeyman, master. Three words that define both skill and status. Trade stretched farther and faster than ever before. Venetian galleys carried silk and spices from the east. Hanseatic merchants hauled timber and grain across the Baltic. Roads improved slightly. Ships grew sturdier, and coins became more common. Where barter once ruled, silver and gold now spoke fluent economy. With trade came banking, and with banking came suspicion. Moneylenders were tolerated but disliked, necessary evils in a world that still thought charging interest was a sin. Wealth changed the tone of society. Merchants started dressing like nobles, buying property, and commissioning art that outshone cathedrals. The old order didn't like it. A man who rose by trade rather than birth was both admired and resented. But money, once it starts flowing, tends to drown objections. Cities like Florence, Bruges, and Lubeck thrived, proof that prosperity could be built rather than inherited. Daily life in a town was chaotic and fascinating. Streets were narrow, muddy, and alive. Bakers shouted, blacksmiths hammered, pigs roamed freely. Water was fetched, gossip traded, and everyone threw waste out the window. The middle class was still a few centuries away from plumbing, yet in that noise was progress, literacy, trade, art, and freedom. Markets weren't just about goods, they were theaters of ideas. Travelers brought news, scholars debated in taverns, printers, eventually, spread pamphlets that questioned everything. The city taught people to think differently, to measure value not by divine decree, but by negotiation and demand. And with towns came connection. Roads linked markets, ports linked continents, and slowly Europe began to resemble something like a network. Trade wasn't only about profit, it was about transformation. Ideas and goods moved together. A sack of pepper might travel beside a new mathematical theorem. By the late Middle Ages, merchants had built the skeleton of modernity. They replaced tribute with contracts, loyalty with credit, destiny with opportunity. The medieval town, loud and filthy as it was, became humanity's first laboratory for ambition. Art, music, and the sound of civilization. For most of the Middle Ages, art existed because faith demanded it. Painting, sculpture, and music were all made to please heaven, not galleries. Yet within that obedience, beauty flourished. Even the most devout craftsmen, chiseling saints from stone or scribbling angels into parchment margins, left behind glimpses of rebellion. Proof that the human urge to create was stronger than any sermon. Early medieval art was devotional and symbolic. Perspective didn't matter, storytelling did. Christ floated above a flat landscape, saints looked identical except for their props, and gold backgrounds replaced sky. The goal wasn't realism, but transcendence. A painting wasn't meant to show what the world looked like. It was meant to show what it meant. The result was haunting. art that shimmered with mystery rather than accuracy. By the 12th century, the Gothic age had arrived, and suddenly everything pointed upwards. Cathedrals became galleries of light. Stained glass windows told entire Bibles in color and glass, transforming sunlight into theology. Stone masons filled every inch with figures, gargoyles sneering from the eaves, angels supporting arches, kings and demons locked in eternal argument. Those cathedrals weren't just places of worship. They were public textbooks for the illiterate. Every carving was a lesson, every window a sermon. Manuscript illumination turned books into treasures. Monks and nuns spent lifetimes bent over desks, turning ink and gold leaf into miracles. Margins filled with saints, dragons, and the occasional rude joke. Proof that even holiness couldn't suppress humor. Each letter gleamed like a jewel, and each page was worth more than a house. The slow artistry of those manuscripts was humanity's way of whispering, "I was here," or across centuries of silence. Music followed the same path from simplicity to splendor. Early chant was pure sound, one voice, one line, no harmony. It filled churches like mist, slow and meditative. But then someone somewhere decided to add another note. Harmony was born, and with it, Western music as we know it. Polyphony, motets, and masses evolved, turning prayer into architecture made of sound. Organs thundered, choirs soared, and for a brief moment, the air itself seemed divine. Art spilled out of the church eventually. As trade and cities grew, so did secular life, in patrons who wanted paintings of themselves, not saints. The late Middle Ages gave us altarpieces that doubled as portraits, frescoes showing not only heaven, but history. Artists began to study nature, bodies, perspective. By the 14th century, in Italy especially, something new was stirring. A quiet rebellion that would soon be called the Renaissance. But even before that, medieval artists were inching toward realism, as if they'd grown tired of looking only upward and wanted to capture what was right in front of them. Music, too, found a life outside monasteries. Traveling minstrels and troubadours sang of love, war, and scandal. Their lyrics were earthy, clever, and often unprintable. They were the pop stars of their day, carrying gossip across kingdoms, one verse at a time. They gave voice to emotions the church never dared name: longing, lust, laughter. A lute, a voice, and an audience was all it took to turn daily life into legend. What's astonishing is how much of this creativity survived. Despite wars, fires, reformations, and time itself, medieval art still radiates life. The carved faces of unknown masons still stare down from cathedrals. The delicate notes of anonymous composers still echo through stone halls. For a world often painted as dark and brutal, the Middle Ages produced art that glows with faith, curiosity, and defiance. It's tempting to think they built for God alone, but maybe that's not true. Maybe deep down they built for us, for the strangers who'd come centuries later, still awed by the idea that in an age of hardship, people could create such beauty just because they wanted to. Love, marriage, and the curious rules of the heart. Love in the Middle Ages came with more paperwork than passion. Marriage wasn't about romance. It was an economic contract, a peace treaty, or a business merger disguised as holy sacrament. But beneath the legal language in church Latin, people still found ways to fall hopelessly, inconveniently, gloriously in love. For peasants, marriage was mostly practical. You pick someone from the same village, someone with healthy teeth and decent stamina for farm work. Dowries were small, ceremonies modest, and the priest's blessing often an afterthought. What mattered was alliance. Two families agreeing not to starve separately. Love could come later, if you were lucky and had enough bread left over to feel sentimental. Among nobles, marriage was warfare without swords. Unions were arranged to gain land, titles, or allies. Children were betrothed before they could walk. A wedding could seal peace between rival houses or secure an inheritance that might otherwise disappear into the hands of some unwanted cousin. Brides arrived with chests of linens, coins, and property rights. Grooms arrived with political ambition and usually less charm than advertised. But even in those gilded prisons, the heart misbehaved. Troubadours, poets, and musicians from southern France turned longing into art. Their songs celebrated courtly love, passionate, often forbidden, and conducted entirely through glances, poems, and dramatic sighing. The ideal lover adored a married lady from afar, serving her with loyalty and restraint. It was a paradox, love as moral exercise, adultery as philosophy. Still, the songs were catchy and nobles ate it up. The church, meanwhile, struggled to define marriage's boundaries. Early on, it wasn't even a church affair. It was a private contract between families. But as centuries passed, priests muscled in, declaring marriage a sacred union blessed by God and regulated by canon law. Consent became essential, though how freely it was given depended on how persuasive your parents were. Divorce was technically impossible, annulments expensive, and adultery punishable, mostly if you were the woman. For ordinary people, marriage rituals were community events. The couple might exchange vows at the church door, then proceed to an all-day feast. Bread, ale, music, and occasionally a fistfight marked the occasion. Bedding ceremonies, where witnesses ensured the marriage was properly sealed, were alarmingly public. Privacy was a luxury few could afford, even on their wedding night. Widowhood, on the other hand, brought a strange freedom. A widow could own property, run businesses, and choose whether to remarry. Some didn't. They had seen how marriage worked and decided independence was the better vow. Love outside marriage existed in full, messy color. Adultery, fornication, and scandal were as medieval as cathedrals. The church preached chastity. The population quietly ignored it. There were brothels in every city, convents that bent rules, and stories of knights sneaking into gardens under moonlight. Human desire, it turns out, doesn't vanish because theology disapproves. But there were tender stories too, letters between separated spouses, poems written for beloveds long gone, songs about devotion that outlasted war and plague. Marriage could be cruel or kind depending on luck and timing, but love itself refused to stay obedient. Even literature wrestled with it. The Romance of the Rose, Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere. These tales blurred the line between virtue and passion, showing how love could be both salvation and disaster. To love truly was to suffer nobly. The medieval heart was dramatic, superstitious, and full of contradictions, which frankly makes it timeless. By the late Middle Ages, affection had begun to creep into marriage contracts. Couples wrote about companionship, loyalty, and mutual comfort. The church frowned, poets cheered, and slowly the idea of marrying for love, once laughable, began to sound almost sensible. In the end, medieval people loved much like we do, imperfectly, courageously, sometimes foolishly. They wrote about it, sang about it, died for it, and occasionally managed to live with it. Their rules were rigid, but their hearts refused to be. The end of the age, change, memory, and what survived. By the 15th century, the world that had defined the Middle Ages was beginning to come undone. The old order, kings, monks, knights, and peasants, each knowing their place, was cracking under the weight of change. What had once seemed eternal now looked temporary, and for the first time in centuries, people started to suspect that tomorrow might not look like yesterday at all. The reasons were everywhere. Trade had transformed Europe's economy, pouring silver through towns that once ran on barter and prayer. Merchants became rich enough to rival nobles. Scholars started arguing with priests, and the printing press, that tiny machine with terrifying potential, began multiplying ideas faster than the church could burn them. Suddenly, knowledge wasn't locked in monasteries anymore. It could be bought, copied, questioned. The Black Death had already loosened the screws on feudalism. When half the population dies, the survivors get picky about wages. Laborers demanded pay instead of service. Peasants bought their freedom, and lords who couldn't adapt found themselves irrelevant. Serfdom didn't vanish overnight, but it started to look embarrassingly old-fashioned, like insisting the earth was flat when cartographers were already drawing curves. The church, once the unshakable center of life, faced its own storm. Corruption scandals, political rivalries, and the Western Schism, when multiple popes fought over who was the real one, cracked its moral armor. People didn't lose faith in God, but they began to lose faith in his management. Whispered reform turned into protest, and protest would soon become reformation. Art, once confined to scripture, began looking outward. Painters studied perspective and anatomy. Sculptors gave marble muscle and movement. Suddenly, human beings looked divine enough on their own. In Italy, the Renaissance was already tuning its instruments, a symphony of curiosity that would drown out the last echo of the medieval choir. But not everything vanished. The Middle Ages left fingerprints on everything that followed. Universities, born in monastery classrooms, became the engines of science. Cathedrals still dominated skylines, their spires daring the heavens. Legal systems, town charters, and trade routes all grew from medieval roots. Even democracy's early murmurs came from medieval parliaments, arguing about taxes no one wanted to pay. The medieval mind, though superstitious and cautious, also carried resilience. People who lived through war, famine, and plague learned the art of endurance. They built communities that could survive collapse. They sang, they painted, they prayed, and they buried their dead with care. Not because they expected reward, but because they refused to surrender dignity to despair. We call it the Dark Ages, but that's a cruel shorthand. It was a time of fear, yes, but also invention. Ignorance, but also imagination. It gave us the very tools we later used to move beyond it. Without monks, no libraries. Without knights, no chivalry. Without the church, no universities. Without those anonymous craftsmen chiseling saints into stone, we might never have learned that beauty can be a kind of prayer. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, the people who lived through it didn't know they were leaving an era behind. They still lit candles at dusk, still told old stories by the hearth, still believed that the world was a fragile bridge between sin and salvation. But beneath that faith, something had shifted. The belief that humans could shape their own fate. And so the curtain fell, not with apocalypse, but with awakening. Knights hung up their swords, monks opened their books, and merchants set sail for continents no one had imagined. The world turned, quietly and irrevocably, toward modernity. The medieval centuries ended as they had lived, with equal measures of faith and fear. But in their ruins we find the beginnings of ourselves, our hunger for meaning, our obsession with progress, our endless attempt to balance reason and wonder. The Middle Ages never truly ended. They just changed costume. And somewhere in the echo of a church bell, in the worn steps of a cathedral staircase, or in a song that's been sung for 1,000 years, you can still feel them. Those strange, resilient people who dreamed in Latin, prayed in candlelight, and built a world sturdy enough for us to stand on. The Middle Ages left their fingerprints on everything we touch, our laws, our words, our fears. For all its brutality, it was an age that still believed in wonder. People built cathedrals from dust, sang prayers to the stars, and faced the dark with stories instead of certainty. If you've listened this far, you've walked with them through frost, faith, and folklore. You've seen that even in the harshest times, humanity still found ways to imagine beauty. Thank you for joining me on this quiet journey through history. If you'd like to hear more stories from forgotten centuries, you know where to find me. Until next time, rest well and may the past keep its peace.